orange and red, I hope the colors come through, have all been built since about 1970, which is about 2/3 of the region. A huge, huge amount. Going into the particular types, this urban region, like most of our cities around the world, started out as a relatively simple place morphologically with a few basic forms, and now is a collage of many different forms region-wide, which all have different environmental and social characteristics. If you look at which forms are winning out in the 21st century or in the late 20th century, a few stand out. We have in the US a major problem with what I call rural sprawl, which is basically 1 to 10 acre lots, very, very low density development. Consumes enormous amounts of land, very high vehicle use, many other environmental problems. Obviously suburban tracts and increasingly upscale, what I call upscale enclave communities, are taking over larger portions of the landscape. So if we were to redo this map looking at landscape types, we see basically the yellow and the red are most of the space. That's the tracts and that's the rural sprawl. We can go further and start looking at the environmental performance of these landscapes. And I'm not going to go through this in detail. Basically, most of the more recent types of built form that are being built emphasize hardscape. They are not very good on any sort of tree coverage or other sorts of ecosystem inclusion. Not very good at retaining runoff, exacerbate urban heat island effects, and so forth. I think we're going to see a lot more work in this vein in the next decade or so. Many urban planning regions in the US and I think internationally are starting to use place-type menus or other types of form-based strategies to plan, and I think we start to need to put better numbers on these landscapes at the building scale and in many other ways as well. This is the vehicle miles traveled, the transportation demand for these landscapes. The red areas are about 3 times the driving per capita of the urban core. So that was a US city. I'm in the process of looking at 15 international cities with similar sorts of analysis. Let's just very briefly look at Cairo. Cairo has like most rapidly developing cities, has a number of very dense forms and informal forms at the core of the metropolitan region. These score well on compactness or density or some of these things that those of us in the US would like to see our cities illustrating, but they obviously have, as George has said, very large problems with basic infrastructure, sanitation, water, public health, and so forth. As we move a bit outwards, or usually it's outwards, but sometimes it's other directions, we find a variety of newer forms that are being created, higher apartment blocks, garden suburbs of different sorts, and increasingly some of the same sorts of low-density forms that we are familiar with in North America, including large houses, swimming pools, lakes, lots of nice amenities, but a much higher consumptive lifestyle. And we see, of course, many large industrial forms as well, which on the one hand may be a great boon to the society. On the other hand, they tend to create very large constellations of employment that often are far removed from where the workforce is located and maybe not meshed well with the social fabric there. Just to look briefly at China, much of China, as far as I can see, is developing using a superblock model of large buildings, often 10 to 20 stories, in a compound that is often a kilometer on each side, or something on that scale. Again, very dense, very compact, which is a goal that we in the US are often striving for. But I'm not sure it's going to meet sustainability goals in many other ways. The transportation tends to be on large arterials, sort of a super grid of arterials around these blocks. Those streets are motor vehicle oriented. Increasingly, people are taking scooters instead of bikes and cars instead of either. They are liable to be gated off or not to be as penetrable and connected as we would like to see urban fabric. And I think there are a number of issues that may rear their heads for that model of development as well. So I could go on about urban form, but I think looking not just at the numbers of new residents of cities, but the forms in which they will be living is going to be a very key component of urban sustainability. Let me just touch on one other more or less related branch of my own work, which has been to look at climate change planning. And in particular, a couple years ago, I did a survey of U.S. state and municipal climate change plans, looking at all the state plans, all the large city plans, and some of these smaller city plans. And similar to what I think some of the previous presenters at our panels have noted, this climate change planning is far from adequate. It's fairly easy to set goals. It's fairly easy for mayors to sign on to the mayor's agreement on climate change. It's relatively easy for cities to join ICLE. It's much harder for them to make their way through all of ICLE's 5 steps. It's much harder for them to actually put resources behind their plan. It's much harder for them to come back year after year and evaluate progress. What we're seeing is a lot of cities picking the low-hanging fruit, improving municipal operations, doing green buildings, green fleets. And there's a lot of creative effort out there. There's a huge amount of creative effort, but quite a long way to go. So where does this leave us? After 30 to 40 years of an urban sustainability discourse, we still are in the early stages. And more to the point, we are not even talking about many of the most important underlying subjects. Consumption, particularly in affluent nations. Population, and this is a very difficult subject that needs to be handled in a diplomatic and nuanced manner, but is an important thing to be handled. Mobility, which is actually a form of consumption, but is so central to our society that I think merits its own discussion. We have a belief that we can have ever-increasing mobility. Well, that is, on the face of it, unsustainable, and particularly if it's going to involve motor vehicles or jet airplanes. And, of course, equity. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Ehrlich and Holdren's 1970s formula, IPAT, global environmental impact as a function of population, affluence, and technology. I would rephrase that a little bit for the 21st century, but I think it still applies. And I had a bit of a discussion with George this morning about this. Population can't be the only focus, and in fact I would put consumption first as the focus and use the actual word consumption rather than affluence, because I like to think that we can have an affluent society that is still not highly consumptive. And that we need to get equity in. And as India, China, other nations demand parity in terms of quality of life and lifestyle, we need to find some middle ground of consumption that can be shared. Technology, I actually think, is the least of it. We have the technology right now to do what we need to live sustainably. The problem is that we are not using it. It is a problem of political ecology and social ecology. So to get back to the initial subject of this panel, is sustainability possible through rapid urban and population growth? I don't think it is. We have not been doing that well to date, with the population that we have, let alone with another 50 or 70% in many of our global cities. We have this rising demand for a quality of lifestyle or access to a high quality lifestyle from much of the world that we in the West have to respond to. The physical forms of urbanization, which are my personal interests, are not taking us in a direction of sustainability. And then I don't think we really, although we are all doing great work in our particular specific scientific areas, I don't think we have come together to develop a critique or vision of the overall social ecology that might get us to urban sustainability. I'm going to try to respond directly to the subtitle of this panel, which is the role of rate, scale, location, form, and function. Hopefully I have a few more minutes. And we have to look at how development has occurred in the last century or so. The rate is increasingly fast. And this is a problem on a practical level for urban planners around the world. You know, they often are so busy responding to rapid development coming in that it's very difficult to plan proactively. Scale is increasing very rapidly, which we could deconstruct these a lot of different ways, but that also increases the burden on the local planners and tends to put things in a mass-produced scale that doesn't always work in terms of innovation, creativity, nuance, context, many of the things you want for a human-scaled green city in the long run. Location, I think I've shown where much development is going. We have, and I personally would like a target of 100% infill for U.S. cities. We have so much land that we have developed so badly. I think any expansion is unnecessary and counterproductive at this point, but we can have a debate on that. You know, the different countries have set different targets. The Blair administration set a target of like 65% in Britain, which is a much more developed country than we. Forms, I've already mentioned a bit, and then function. We have had development oriented towards economic and transportation efficiency as the primary driving values, if you get back to sort of a Lynchian approach to urban form and design. And those are not the values we need. We need social and ecological sustainability. I think we need to take our discussion of sustainability planning to a totally different level than we have been doing to date. We need to think about how do we plan for a society in which we can plan. We need to address the fact that we do not have a functional democracy in the US, for example, and that we have a whole set of forces that have put us on an unsustainable track for 100 years or more. I actually agree with the Tea Party about one thing, which is that our system is broken. And just as someone who follows politics, the word dysfunctional crops up so much, both with reference to California and with Washington these days. I think we need to have a discourse on this. And I know we are academics and we specialize in particular things, but I think academics also have the luxury of being able to look at big pictures. And I think we have a responsibility to put pictures together for the public and for decision makers. So I would hope that as this effort goes forward and lots of great research on cities worldwide takes place, that we can also knit things together into a vision of a healthy urban ecology, social ecology, political ecology, whatever terms you want to use. I'm not going to belabor some of the particular things I think could go into that. I've probably spoken for long enough already. But I think we need to, even if we have backgrounds in environmental science or urban planning, we need to think about what would make for a democracy that could actually respond to these problems. And an economy that could actually be green. There are particular research needs that I think could help a lot. I am particularly interested in scenario planning or scenario development. Downscaling, I have a couple projects where we're trying to downscale IPCC scenarios, A2 and B1, to part of California, and also add a new scenario which is greener than B1, and we call it AB32 Plus after the main California climate change planning legislation. So I think we need to take as a field, a role in developing this sort of scenario, this sort of vision. I put a couple historic visions on there, as well as understanding some of the more detailed aspects of urban metabolisms, systems, behavior change, and so forth. And I will leave it there. I hope I have been sufficiently provocative. I would be glad to talk further or respond to questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And our last speaker is Bill Solecki. And Bill will talk to us about crisis and transition. So, Bill, I'm going to do this for you.
Okay, great. I'm not usually in this role, but I'm going to be, I think, the slightly upbeat person comparison, even given my title as well. Crisis right in the beginning. I want to thank you all to be here again on an afternoon to hear a couple things that I have to say. I've been interested in the issue of environmental hazards for about 20, almost 25 years, I guess, and sort of struck how they play out in places, particularly cities. And that sort of has matured and changed over time, and looking at the process of urban environmental change and trying to understand a little bit about how environmental or how hazards sort of fits into the question of environmental change. And then with that sort of changing nature of places and what we can take from that to both sort of in kind of historical perspective look at how cities have responded to crises in the past, what we can learn from that, but then also to maybe take some of this understanding and sort of look toward the future as ways of identifying various opportunities for sustainability. So that's what I want to chat a little bit about. I'm going to go over some basic definitions, talk a little bit about this idea of transitions in cities, and then a couple of case examples. So instead of large swaths of territory, I'm going to try to spend a lot of time talking about a few things and then have a couple of case examples to kind of illustrate some points. So when I'm talking about transitions, I mean, again, there's lots of different ways of defining this and thinking about this, but what I'm thinking about in particular is when a place, for a variety of reasons, sort of changes, it sort of is no longer the place it was. Something happens, something emerges, and my sort of notion about places is that, you know, that they're sort of tension-filled. There are various sort of dynamics at work, sort of undercutting the very kind of premise of how that place is organized. And at some point, you know, there's a kind of a resetting. There's moments of crisis. In that resetting, sort of new social relations or new relations with nature get defined, and something new emerges. A new place, a new construct that promotes new opportunities for growth. And obviously, you know, as you think about that, that's sort of tying into lots of various perspectives and sort of explanations in terms of environmental change. There are lots of drivers of this process in place. We've heard technology. You can see some of the words on the page here on the screen. Population, poverty, you know, external things like hazards themselves, wealth, accumulation, resource limitations, institutional capacity, and capability, a variety of things. Now within this, there's the issue of crisis, that this idea that transitions emerge during these moments of crisis. The system that's operating becomes under extreme stress and really can't function as it was and has to sort of move on to something else. And sort of in that time, you can talk about sort of phase changes, lots of sort of words that could be thrown in here, tipping points, lots of other sort of elements. Some of these are sort of non-linear, which means there's sort of this sense of a jump where it shifts so much it can never really go back to what it was. And that's kind of an interesting case in particular. And you see this kind of discussion about transition sort of popping up in lots of literatures, both within the social sciences as well as the physical sciences. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now, the environmental transition literature is a lot, as I mentioned, coming out, and very interesting stuff from my perspective, from the ecological systems theories and various sort of other literatures, trying to understand how it is that these transitions take place. And, you know, in some cases from isolated experiments or sort of, you know, isolated sort of field examples, trying to sort of weave out a larger understanding about phase changes, alternative stable states, and the like. Another literature that's coming out associated with this is this issue of early warnings. Like there are sort of elements of how systems operate when they're about to sort of enter into some sort of change. The system responds more slowly. There's some sort of similarity in terms of its state at any particular moment. Basically, this elements of an imbalance in the system, and we can sort of understand this as potential sort of early warning signals of something happening. Some of you might have been sort of familiar with these various kind of images of how these transitions can occur, and these are kind of three different graphics of different sorts of conditions that could emerge. If you're looking at the screen, A and B on the left here sort of illustrate, the dark lines illustrate sort of the equilibrium state of any particular system, and you have the system state as sort of the Y axis, and the conditions, whatever they might be, along the x-axis in this sort of discussion. And so there's an assumption in, let's say, looking at A, that there is going to be this sort of preponderance, or you can use the word resilience if you like, for the system to sort of flow along that at any one particular state